Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Monsignor?
Thank you, Teresa.
It's show number 25.
Well, last time around, we looked at the end of the War for American Independence.
Yes.
And just hinted at the end of that there was now a lot of westward movement on the part of Americans coming over the Alleghenies, coming into the Ohio River Valley, and all the way over to Illinois. And this ended up upsetting a lot of the Creoles who had stayed there, even during the time of the British. The British really didn't have much of a presence there after all, but the Americans did. And we're going to see that a lot of Americans coming out west were just kind of crude people.
Okay.
And so you've got these genteel French Creoles, and they're a little upset by it. One of those we mentioned last time around was none other than Gabriel Siré. He had decided that he was going to move from Kaskaskia, where he had spent a good portion of his life. He had moved there as a young man, like 22 years old, something like that. Now he's in his 50s and 2 daughters and all. And so he moves over to St. Louis. He has a lot of money. He's a very wealthy man from all that merchandising and trading over all those years. So he buys an entire city block for his family, and then turns around and buys another 6,000 acres right off of the Merrimack River. So this guy's got some money. And we also mentioned last time around he was very generous. He was very concerned for orphans, and orphans are going to be a real issue in St. Louis. We'll see a number of orphanages that were set up as time comes. St. Rose Philippine de Chêne will be one of the first to actually set up a real orphanage. He's very concerned about orphans, and then I mentioned also that he opened up his house in Montreal so that other St. Louis merchants who were trading and doing business in Montreal would have a place to stay. So he's a very, very generous man. And he also gave away one of his daughters in marriage to none other than Auguste Chouteau.
Oh, right.
He's that young 13-year-old boy who had come and co-founded St. Louis. Right. Now it's 1786. He has been working his entire life, occupied with business and civic matters, and he's a bachelor of 36 years old. Teresa is the Siré daughter that marries him. She's 17 years old.
Oh, that is a huge difference.
They were obviously in love with each other. It was just a wonderful family that came out of that. Actually, there were 9 children born. Wow. Although only 5 of them survive into adulthood. That happens a lot back in those days. But listen to these age dates of the births. And poor Teresa Chouteau was very busy with domestic things. The first child came along in 1788. That's 2 years after they were married.
Okay.
Then in 1790, another child. In 1792, another child. 1794, another child. They took a little break, and they waited 3 years for the next, 1797, then 1799, 1802, 1805, and 1807. She needed some domestic help, no doubt about it. The other daughter was married to another prominent man here in St. Louis. His name was Antoine Soulard. He was a naval officer and had a lot of skills in engineering, and so when he moved to St. Louis, the Spanish in particular were very interested in using him for surveying. He did a lot of survey in the area that's going to be really important because of those Spanish land grants. And he also decided that he found a piece of property he liked really much, and so he bought it, and we call it Soulard.
Soulard.
That's right. The dowries of all of these were exceptional, and they were creating a real fine family fortune. So a St. Louis elite was beginning to come up around, and we hinted that last time around the Chouteau family. Another recent arrival was a Swiss-born man by the name of Charles Gratteau. And we have a street in St. Louis.
We have all these. These names are very familiar.
And he ends up marrying the youngest of the Chouteau girls. That's Victoire. If you remember when Madame Chouteau came to St. Louis, the littlest baby was in her arms, and that's Victoire.
Oh, okay.
Now she's grown up, and so she marries, and they will have 10 children themselves. And then Others intermarry, and I think I read these off last time around. Again, it reads like a St. Louis city map, okay, a street map. Cabinet, Labadie, Hempstead, DeMunn, and then Emily Ann Gratio is going to also intermarry. She's going to marry Auguste's half-brother, that's Pierre, and he plays a very important role in fur trading, and of course his nickname is Cadet.
Oh, right.
Remember, that's the second oldest. You know, the standard history of St. Louis is by James Neal Prim, who is a professor of history at the University of Missouri St. Louis. And the book is entitled Lion of the Valley. He has some very interesting things to say about this marriage. He says, maintenance of this elite depends upon the intermarriage and the absorption of qualified outsiders, preferably from France.
Oh, okay.
And then I'd like to just read you a brief paragraph he talks about with the death of Madame Choteau. Okay, says this. In the same pattern, the Labadies, Pepins, and Cirés united and reunited amongst themselves with the Choteaus, the Quisereaux, the Dubreuils, the Pratts, the Cabadis, and Sarpis, and other leading Creole families. In 1814, when the revered Grande Dame, Madame Choteau, died in her 82nd year, most of the mourners at her funeral had familial reasons for weeping, some of them several times over. And then this interesting thing here, it says, by that time, this is 1814, by that time, Pierre Laclede was a distant memory for a few older St. Louisans, his name seldom mentioned.
Wow.
Yeah, we'll have forgotten the founder of St. Louis for several decades. And ultimately, the handwritten history of the founding of St. Louis that Auguste Choteau will write down in his old age, when that's rediscovered after his death, then they're going to go, oh, yeah, there was somebody else. Yeah, isn't that something? More and more people are moving to St. Louis. The neighboring villages also began to grow. And especially I'd like to talk about what's called the Four Gracious Daughters.
Okay.
Okay, that's Carondelet, Florissant, St. Charles, and Portage-de-Sioux. Each of them are very interesting. Carondelet had been settled only a few years after St. Louis was founded. And it was founded by someone from St. Genevieve, moved on up and built a stone house on the north side of what is now the River de Pere. His name is Clement Dolor de Treget. About 10 miles south of the village of St. Louis, he sets himself up. Other Creoles begin moving around him, and right away they find that the land there is really good for farming, and so they take up farming. And that becomes really important because, as we've known, St. Louisans don't like to farm. They'll garden, but they didn't farm. They didn't do all those kind of things. They were into commerce, and you know, so somebody had to feed them. And so right away, the people began referring to this little village as Dolor's Village. He stopped that right away, and he said, no, we're going to call this Carondelet. Okay, and that's named after the governor of Louisiana. That's the Baron Francois de Carondelet, French name, but in service of the Spanish government. That's a very smart move. And as a result, Baron Carondelet never came to St. Louis, but he did know that there was a village named after him and went so far as to name Dolor's son, Pierre, as the captain of the militia. So got a nice little title out of all of that. And as a result, now, within a very short period of time, St. Louis was receiving from Carondelet grain and fruits and vegetables and dairy products. So it was really, truck farming for St. Louis. Carondelet also provided something else for St. Louisans, too. It's kind of ironic that right down at that very same spot where it is today, there's a casino. Well, that's because St. Louisans love to gamble, and they weren't very good at it. But the people out in Carondelet were.
Okay.
And so St. Louisans would sneak out of the city, travel the 10 miles down to Carondelet, where they could gamble with impunity because the wife wasn't going to be paying attention. Wasn't watching, and then would make their way back up to St. Louis. Carondelet had a nickname among St. Louisans. The nickname was Vidpoche, empty pocket, because that's how the St. Louisans came back. It's interesting. Carondelet never had that kind of mercantile elite that St. Louis had. These were farmers and took care of daily work and all of that. It was also a very interesting interracial community. The reason for that was that the French Creoles, when they came and settled in Carondelet, many of them brought slaves.
Oh, okay.
But at the time of their death, in their wills, the slaves were freed. And so now you have a free black population living in Carondelet. And also keep in mind that the French and the Spanish have a very different notion than Anglos concerning interracial marriage. And so there was a lot of intermarriage among Creoles, among African Americans, and among Native Americans. So a very different kind of a setting in Carondelet. Mm-hmm. When we look to the north of St. Louis, here we find another village that's founded by a man by the name of Francois Dunjant. This is in 1786. He founds a village that he refers to as St. Ferdinand. Again, a very smart move on his part. St. Ferdinand is St. Ferdinand III, King of Spain. He is the Spanish equivalent of Louis IX, King of France. Saintly king, boy, a lot of parallels. I believe they were actually related to each other. But this turned out to be a very good political move on his part because, once again, when the Spanish authorities found out about it, they then made Dunjant the title was the Civil and Military Commandant at Florissant. Now, that's an interesting thing because the Spanish call that village Florissant, the Valley of Flowers. And that whole region is going to take on that name, while St. Ferdinand is going to be the name of the village, although with time, that's going to be lost. And the only thing that's left of the name St. Ferdinand is the parish, that very old parish, the colonial parish in Florissant.
Which is a beautiful place to go visit.
Yes. The shrine, yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. And again, like Carondelet, the area in Florissant is very rich soil, and so a lot of agriculture, and again, feeding St. Louis as a result. There were no priests in Carondelet and no priests in Florissant, and so poor Father Bernard, remember the first pastor of the parish of St. Louis, had to serve the whole region.
Wow.
And in doing that, he has to speak not only French, but also Spanish, as well as his native German. What happens there is that it's a settlement of an individual. He's a trapper by the name of Louis Blanchette. We know that for the bridge, Blanchette Bridge.
To St. Charles.
Yeah. He's from Canada originally and settles out in this area. He calls the little village he's founding Le Petit Côte, the little hills. And if you've ever been to Old St. Charles, you know it's a pretty hilly place.
It is.
Other trappers begin moving around with him, and so that village now begins to take on its growth. Again, it turns out that west of St. Charles itself is incredibly rich soil.
Yes.
And so now people begin moving out there and begin farming. By 1800, there were something like 80 families living in St. Charles, again, doing a lot of farming as well as a jumping-off point for fur trading. Now, around that same area, there is only further to the east of St. Charles, north and east of St. Charles, is another area where you have the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers coming together. And there you have a man by the name of Francois Saucier. This is 1 year after the founding of St. Louis. Okay, this is in 1765. Saucier moves out to that confluence and settles himself in, again, incredibly rich soil. But, of course, the reason why it's incredibly rich is it floods all the time. Yeah. But nonetheless, he convinced some Creole families to move there. And when it wasn't flooding, it was really very successful. He couldn't get enough French to move there. And so what he did was he advertised over on the other side of the Mississippi River, and he began attracting some Americans.
Okay.
So there were some American families moved over, and they began farming in what's now known as the Portage de Sioux. Okay. But there are difficulties. It turns out that these Americans are a mixed blessing. For one thing, they didn't speak any other language besides English, and they weren't interested. Well, that's sort of like we are. You know?
Yeah, right.
They weren't interested in learning French or Spanish. Many of them were not Catholic. They had a certain anti-Catholic prejudice, anti-French prejudice, anti-Spanish prejudice, and so they were not particularly genteel people. So, at one point, Father Bernard actually writes his superiors in 1787 and begs them to relieve him of his responsibilities. He points out that he's getting up in years, and still he has his assignment in St. Louis, Florissant, Carondelet, St. Charles, and Portage de Sioux, and to make it all the worse, these Americans are coming in, making his life miserable. He said that the reason why more Creoles were coming over was, and I quote here from his letter, to be free of the vexations of the Americans who are on the eastern side of the river. Well, it's going to take 2 years before he gets a letter from the Spanish authorities, and he's allowed to come back to New Orleans, where he is in retirement in a sense, as much as any priest could be in retirement back in those days. He'll die in 1796. Great service to the church.
Absolutely.
Father Limbach's observation offers a glimpse also into the chaos that the church was about to go through in America. Things were just not very clear. And for one thing, the big question was who had ecclesiastical authority and responsibility over what had been the French part of the French Croissant, okay, because that was lost to Britain. I'm talking about east of the Mississippi River. That became British territory. And then in 1783, at the Treaty of Paris, it now becomes American territory. So prior to all of this changearoo, when you go back before 1763, it was the Bishop of Montreal who had jurisdiction. Well, Bishop Brion, who is the Bishop of Montreal at this time, thinks he still does.
Oh.
And when Father Limbach retires, Bishop Brion then sends a young priest down to the area to take his place. This is Father Jabot.
Okay.
We'll be talking a lot about.
Sure.
And he arrives in the Mississippi River Valley, and Bishop Brion then makes him the Vicar General of the region, which isn't saying much because he's the only priest there. So at one point then in 1785, Father Jabot is going to move to Vincennes, where he is from time to time, and he's basically sent to Vincennes under the obedience of Bishop Brion. So we've got this one priest. Remember, he was involved in the American Revolution. This is the man who really won Kaskaskia over for the Americans when George Rogers Clark had come in.
Right.
He's been serving all over the place, and now he's been removed from this area, sent over to Vincennes. So in the St. Louis area, there's no functioning priest right now, but it looks as though something's about to happen, and we're going to get a priest, but it's going to be very confusing. The issue is that Vincennes is in the United States after the Treaty of Paris.
Yes.
And Father John Carroll had been named by the Vatican as the superior of the missions of the United States. So now you've got two individuals, and the question is, who's the ecclesial authority? And it's not going to be a friendly discussion between these two men because they have some history already.
Oh.
Remember? John Carroll, Father Carroll, was among that group that went up to Montreal to try to get Bishop Brion to join in
on their side.
On their side, and he would not do it. So the two of them have a little bit of history going already. Added to this is a windfall for Father Carroll, because after the Battle of Yorktown, and when basically the war came to an end, the French then took their army that had been with Washington at Yorktown, put them on ships and sent them back to France. They weren't needed anymore. But one of the chaplains in the French army asked for permission to stay in the United States and to act as a priest in the United States. His name is Father Paul de la Saint-Pierre, and he's a Carmelite. And he received permission from the Carmelites and from the French government to stay in America and do mission work. Father Carroll said that he would take him on only under the condition that he went west and served the Creole French population there. So here you see that Father Carroll has got a concern for the spiritual needs of the people in this region, and he's going to send a priest in order to go do that. Father Saint Pierre was so excited about his new assignment that he left even before Father Carroll was able to write up his faculties.
Okay.
Yeah. And so he simply arrives in Vincennes with no authority accepted by his word, and there he meets Father Jabot. And this is so complicated now. Father Jabot is the vicar general of this area under the obedience of Bishop Briand, but Father Paul de la Saint-Pierre is under the obedience, although he doesn't have anything in writing, from Father Carroll, who is the superior of the missions of the United States. And then Father Jabot then sends Father Saint-Pierre. He sends him to St. Genevieve because they didn't have a priest there at that point. Okay. So he'll be taking care of the French Creole, just like he was supposed to. And then with a secondary assignment in Kaskaskia. See how complicated this is. Here you have a French Carmelite who had been in the French army, who is now sent by the superior, Father Carroll, into this territory. He arrives, and then he's given another assignment by the Vicar General, but not Father Carroll's Vicar General, but Bishop Briand's Vicar General. And he's then sent to go over the river to Spanish St. Genevieve, where everyone speaks French, right? And also to serve Kaskaskia, which is an American city now, being filled up by Americans. When Father Carroll found out about this, he was just very upset. And evidently had something of a short fuse. And so he writes a letter to Rome, to the prefect of the propaganda, and this is Cardinal Antonelli. He then says, what's going on here? Cardinal Antonelli writes back and said that he doesn't clear things up very well. Basically, what he says is that the Bishop of Quebec would continue to hold jurisdiction in that area, and that Father Carroll's appointment was meant to include only the 13 original colonies. But anyhow, Father Paul de Saint-Pierre comes to St. Genevieve, falls in love with it, does not fall in love with Kaskaskia. He considers it to be a miserable place to live. The Americans have come in, the French Creoles have left. There's no law and order. And not only are the Creoles upset with him, but also the Kaskaskia Indians, who consider these Americans to be uncouth, and many of them left also. If this isn't bad enough, it turns out that there is another priest, an itinerant priest, who all of a sudden shows up. His name is Father de la Valinière. He goes to Father Carroll, again, volunteers his services. Carroll sends him, quote unquote, out west, out of his jurisdiction now, And to show you the intensity of this man, he walked from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. And from there, then, he took a boat, a bateau, down the Ohio River, and then caught another one going up to Kaskaskia. So Father de la Valinière arrives in Kaskaskia. Father Saint-Pierre leaves, like, here, you can have it. And Father Jabot is over in Vincennes, ignoring this guy also. He's a real firebrand. And he begins preaching against all the silliness that is going on in Kaskaskia. He's a real law and order kind of a guy. And eventually, his influence spreads all over that region so much that Father St. Pierre left St. Genevieve.
Wow.
And he said, I'm out of here. He went up to Cahokia and refounded the Holy Family Parish. You remember that the Holy Family Parish had pretty much gone dormant after so many of the Native Americans left.
Yes.
And all. But now he's going to rebuild that and get that up going again. Eventually, he's going to settle back in St. Genevieve. And Father Jabot is interesting. He's going to leave Vincennes and go to New Madrid. What you had was in St. Genevieve itself, once Father St. Pierre comes back, is dealing with some irregularities within the town itself. You have one situation in which, and he was quite concerned about this, there was one of the Creole men was actually cohabiting with an English woman, and he tried to get that taken care of. They were not going to go along with it, and ultimately he convinced the commandant, Francois Vallée, to break that group up, and so they eventually did in 1796.
So we are really out of time, so if we have a quick blessing.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.